Okay, and I think we are live. So I see attendees beginning to get added to the room here. Thank you all so much for joining us here today on the second at one of these we've done this week on the pretty unprecedented set of events that have been taking place in Afghanistan over the last week. This is a live recording of the Lawfare Podcast. We are going to be recording this and using the audio and editing it for a podcast tomorrow, but because events are moving very quickly on the ground, we know there's a lot of interest in these. We decided to do it before a live audience and to post the video in advance of the podcast editing so that people can get this information as quickly as possible and hopefully make use of it. I'm Scott Anderson, I'm a senior fellow at Lawfare. Thank you so much to our three guests who are joining me. We posted information about them on Lawfare. I'm not going to do the introduction here. We record that separately just to give us more time to have a conversation. I will just note two caveats for the audience before we get started. As I noted, this is a podcast recording, so you may hear a little bit of stage direction and a little bit of pausing and ums as we go through. That will be edited out as you listen to the version tomorrow. That is the reality of podcast recording and production. The second thing I will note is there is, of course, a risk of technical error. We did have that happen during our last recording, as my in-laws' internet is not as stable as one might hope. I'm back at home. My internet's better here. Fingers crossed we will not have any problems. But if they are, please just bear with us. We will get everything back online as quickly as possible. With that, let's go ahead and move on to the substance. Chris, since you're back with us now, thank you so much for joining us. Let me start with you. Can you give us a sense of the current state of play at Kabul International Airport right now? We know this has become the focus of this effort to evacuate vulnerable Afghans, and not just vulnerable Afghans, also American citizens, American employees, citizens and employees of other countries as well. What does the situation look like on the ground there, and how has it been changing over the last few days?
It's very chaotic still. I mean, we are 4 days into this right now. There are real signs of desperation. There are crowds of people, frankly, going from gate to gate based on rumors, being harassed by the Taliban. And when I say crowds of people, I don't mean a couple dozen here and there. I'm talking thousands of people. The Taliban are dispersing them through sporadic gunfire, and that is causing civilian casualties. It's also leading to conflicts with U.S. military forces, running gun battles throughout the area. So it is still a very kinetic and chaotic situation. And it doesn't look like, I understand the State Department is trying to work with CENTCOM to get that under control, but as of right now, our understanding is it's not there.
So tell us, what is the process that's being put in place at the airport by the U.S. forces and allied forces that are in control, and to the extent we have one? We understand they've secured a perimeter. There are gates that are being manned with some effort. I think we've all seen pictures of the razor wire that's been set up as a kind of strategic barrier. But what is, to the extent they can, the level of order, organization, and structure that they're trying to bring to the situation there?
They're prioritizing U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents and some SIVs. And they are essentially trying to act as Customs and Border Patrol agents at Kabul Airport to get people into what is effectively U.S. territory, right? So we own Kabul Airport. There is some poor, 19-year-old on the front line right now that is going through people's paperwork and trying to make sure they are who they say they are, and they're bringing them in, and then from there they're putting them on flights and they're flying them out to third countries. That is not a sustainable solution. I understand the State Department is surging resources. They're surging consular officers. They're bringing a senior administration official on the ground to help organize the situation. But at the end of the day, the process is not streamlined. And if this is going to get resolved anytime quickly, it needs to be broad. And I understand that a lot of people in the administration are very afraid of just letting anybody on a flight. But we need to stop checking people's papers at the front because people are burning their documents, they're burning their visas, they're they're destroying things, the very requirements that we are looking for to guarantee them a flight on the ground. I can confirm, I just got off the phone with a senior official at the State Department, and I can confirm last night they've been trying to work around some of the measures that the Taliban have put in place. So the Taliban have basically said, we're not going to be letting anybody who doesn't have a US visa or doesn't have or is an American citizen into the airport. The State Department has tried to find some workaround ways. That has not been successful, and it is essentially causing mass flows of individuals from the city to the airport. I can't overstate this enough. I am not a hyperbolic person. The people on this call will tell you it is a mess. And I'm not trying to tell the administration how to do it, but they need to find a way very quickly to have a secure egress point from the Kabul area, whether it's HKIA, whether it's a different location or whatever. But right now, there is no process.
Susannah, let me pivot to you to build off of a point that I think Chris has started walking us down, and that is that there are a lot of people trying to get out of Afghanistan right now through Kabul International Airport, HKIA for Hamid Karzai International Airport, I think is the proper name. Walk us through this a little bit. Who are the different groups, and what are the different types of barriers and experiences that they're having? I think we can set aside, we understand there are American personnel, American citizens, and from other allied governments, foreign allied governments trying to make their way there. That's one category, seems to be the focus of a lot of US and foreign government efforts right now. But then, of course, there's a whole range of Afghans that fit into different sorts of categories and levels of treatment. Can you flesh that out for us a little bit and give us a sense about what they're experiencing on the ground?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a difficult question because of part of what Chris explained, which is if the Taliban is setting up checkpoints on the road to the airport, the Kabul airport, and they're looking specifically for paperwork, and people fear for their lives if they're identified as having a special immigrant visa or any level of vulnerability or just a matter of uncertainty of what the Taliban checkpoint officers would do, they're burning their identification. And so one of the ways that we would distinguish between, well, this person gets in under this processing and this person gets under that processing, that would be identified in their paperwork, which they're destroying. And they're destroying it so as not to be prevented from going to the airport or not to be killed on the way to the airport. So in many ways, the discussion of who and how they're coming would be somewhat moot. We do know, obviously, LPRs, legal permanent residents, and US citizens are presenting themselves, and even those are having significant problems at getting to the airport, or putting themselves, they described that they felt that their lives were at risk in the crowds trying to get at the airport. You've seen scenes that might illustrate why. And then, if you do want to understand P1 or P2 or SIVs, essentially, P1 is the UN, UNHCR, or the US government vis-a-vis US embassies or international NGOs who are appointed to refer folks for resettlement, refugees, people who are designated already as refugees, meaning they went through the refugee status determination process already, which is long and arduous. And they've been, one of these three groups has sent this on to the US government for referral for the refugee program. P2 is a very narrow scope of vulnerable populations that are referred by their employers. And then finally, special immigrant visas are interpreters, translators, people who worked with the US mission who are vulnerable because of their affiliation with us. There's a whole other group of people that you and I would just naturally know about. Like, what about women's rights defenders that didn't work for an American organization, but are well known for their work in Afghanistan? What about journalists, freelance journalists who covered, sort of information about the Taliban that they weren't happy about? All of these people are vulnerable. And so when Chris says processing and how they're coming through, it's past the processing moment. We've, very artful immigration groups. I'm representing as a fellow for Truman National Security Project right now, but my day job is leading congressional advocacy for a major resettlement agency. We usually like nuance. At this point, we're looking at a Saigon level evacuation. You don't check their papers. You don't act as CBP officers. You get vulnerable people who are at threat of death onto planes to a third country, where you then evaluate whether, which process, which particular avenue they're going to come through. We got 130 people to Guam, and then we processed them in Vietnam after leaving Vietnam in 1975. We had got 130,000 Vietnamese evacuees to Guam, and then we processed them on that state before they moved on. This needs to be considered at that level, if not more problematic, because there are no seafaring, there's no water option to get people out. There's only flights. So that airport is the way out because most borders are closed. So this is when you think of Saigon, think of this as a moment that we'll look back, and there will be a new name for evacuations when the US withdraws from a country.
So, Susannah, let me follow up on one aspect of that. And Chris and Camille, you weigh into this as well, because I'm not sure who might have the best sense of this, which is that you made this point, which I think is really important. Kabul airport is the only way out right now. And that's not just for American efforts, although Americans primarily seem to be the ones in control of the facility, although there are other foreign troops there. I know there's British contingent, I believe German troops as well, can have access and some degree of control there. But of course, anybody who has a private flight or a private airlines or other groups want to be able to use this airport because it's the only way out if you're a Kabul private citizen or if you're a private organization trying to bring people out. We know early on when the US took control of the airport, they shut down those private flights for what, by my understanding, was a relatively brief period. I understand they are happening again, but how are they fitting into this picture? Is it truly a limited channel? I know a lot of international airlines and things are not operating, so I think we're primarily talking about charter flights. What is the medley of routes out that are being channeled through Kabul airport, or is it really at this point primarily a USG and foreign government dominated channel?
So we can look at the public statements that the US government has made. Press Secretary Kirby yesterday in a briefing reiterated numbers that he's been sharing recently, which is that the US military has the capacity on the military side alone to move 5,000 people a day. He said in yesterday's press briefing that the airport inside of the airport is completely secured by the US military. These are his statements. And yet we only moved 2,000 individuals yesterday. If we keep this pace, we leave 3,000 a day of vulnerable populations in Kabul with no means of exit. So that's what's happening. On the commercial side, in briefings, Pentagon and briefings yesterday, they also mentioned that while military flights were moving out on the north military side of the airport, commercial flights were inconsistent. We also know that the FAA said yesterday that they would permit US airlines to fly in and out commercial flights to the Kabul airport. So we have that kind of scope, but getting on the ground information that commercial flights are running currently, we don't see evidence that that is the case, that consistently that is the case, and we certainly need it. And we look for private efforts to get commercial flights for the citizens who do have visas, because we have people with visas at the airport unable to fly because they can't get through inside of the airport. And it's not clear whether, in addition, the commercial flights would be there for them to take.
Camille, let me come to you. A lot of the barrier we've been talking about so far are in very different circumstances, very familiar ones to people working in immigration and refugee law, the visa process, the SIV process. And these are processes that, in the best of circumstances, can take a very, very long time, of which there are a lot of administrative and bureaucratic barriers in place. How are they interfacing with this very urgent situation on the ground? Are they simply still being an obstacle? Are there efforts being made to circumvent some of these? I know Chris and Susannah both hit on the need to essentially move these processes further steps down in the process, get people to a safe location, and then begin to pursue these legal processes. But what steps have been taken in the current status quo to try and alleviate some of the pressures of those, or are they still just a big bureaucratic bottleneck?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail right on the head with that. I mean, that's sort of almost the crisis to come, or the potential crisis to come, because this is about to collide with a very broken, very decimated, very under-resourced and pressured immigration system, which is already by design sort of set up to make anybody, especially including those who are seeking protection, fail. So that, I think, is the next step. I mean, right now, the effort of the last however many days or hours at this point, right, since Saturday, is really to get everybody out. And Chris sort of hinted at that earlier. We don't want the military playing the CBP agent at the airport. Like, just get everybody out and we'll triage and we'll figure out what's going to happen next in terms of the legal needs and the legal statuses that they need to enter the United States and remain in the United States. But the more we lean on third countries, the more problematic that is for a lot of obvious reasons. We saw a very, very small window into what that might look like with the roughly 1,200 who made it to Fort Lee before the crisis really hit, before Kabul fell and the Taliban regained control of the country. That started, Susannah and Chris can correct me, but from memory, it started late July into early August. And we saw those were individuals who were very much in the late stages of the visa. And also many of those individuals were not the principal applicants. They were family members who were coming to the US to join principal applicants, many of whom were already in the US. And even that was quite confusing, although I did see the immigration agencies take a more affirmative role in the process, actually going to Fort Lee to process the applications and trying to speed things up as much as possible in a way that I've never seen before. And that certainly we don't is probably not scalable, to the levels that we need it to be now. So if I think a lot of the answers to that question hinge on how many come to the US directly, or potentially, there are still options available in US territories such as Guam and such, versus how much we're going to rely on third countries and what happens in those third countries. But the US immigration system is designed to lose people. It is designed to confuse them and make it hard for them to understand what the expectations and the requirements are. There's no right to an attorney in immigration, certainly not in what we call the affirmative process, which is this process, right? When you're asking for a benefit, not when you're defending yourself in immigration court. And when you're asking for a benefit, you have no right to an attorney whatsoever, even one that you pay for. So you're either lucky enough to find one in time, or you're forced to go through the process on your own. And that's, in a normal circumstance, incredibly confusing. And in a chaotic situation like this, not helped by things, for example, the Department of State putting out what they're calling an entry pass to the airport right now for individuals who are trying to enter the airport, but that they're printing on US visa templates and actually has the word visa on it. And so now individuals are confused as to whether or not they have a visa to the US or just permission to enter the airport.
This point you make about third-party countries, I want to bring that in here because that has been a big focus in certainly the kind of media reporting from the State Department for the administration and in a newspapers talking about, okay, well, we have now Uganda on board to accept 3,000 to 4,000 people. Philippines are on board, Kuwait. What is the state of this effort? And what exactly is happening with people when they go there? Of course, they're going to enter a legal process that they are not going to go through, as you noted, at a firm time frame and may not get through at all in terms of resettlement to the United States. What happens to people stuck in that circumstance then? Does it essentially become a matter of local immigration law and refugee law? How is that? What is the role in the overall picture that these foreign kind of third-party stopping points are playing in this process?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it becomes a matter of what those third countries, what their immigration laws allow. If they have deportation agreements with the current government of Afghanistan, and what kind of protections they offer, whether they're signatories to the UN Refugee Convention or to any sort of international protocols regarding how we treat and protect migrants. But ultimately, immigration anywhere is always viewed as a sovereign matter first. And so it really does come down to what those third country governments are going to decide to do. And that's why from the start, we've been pushing for, long before any of this started, right? Starting in April, when the withdrawal was announced, we've been pushing at a minimum to have these individuals brought to Guam, where they can have their US immigration options resolved and have access to all of the protections and all of the benefits that our laws might offer.
Camille, if I could just jump in there, you bring up a really good point, and the well, the first thing I want to say is Camille talked about, whether or not a country has deportation agreements with the current country of Afghanistan. And I think what is important for us all to keep in context is that the country that we knew of Afghanistan on Friday does not exist. And so there are a lot of people who are saying, well, what if their travel documents are expired? Well, everybody's travel documents from Afghanistan is expired now because the country is no longer there to enforce it. And so, the time for nuance in this administration is over. The time they had months and months and weeks and I'm not here to say I told you so, but we told them that this was coming, and the time for them to figure out the process to do this in an orderly way is over. And they just need to get people on planes and figure it out later. And whether they go to a third country or not, I understand that there are reports of planes of Afghans heading to third countries that have been turned around or diverted to different landing strips because those countries don't want these Afghans in their country. And frankly, it is not their responsibility. This is not Kuwait's fault. This is not the Qatar's fault. This is America's fault. And it's our responsibility to fix this. And we have a precedent for it. We've done it before. And, I'm sorry that it's going to require some extra effort on behalf of the US government to bring these people to US territory and sort it out. And, I'm sorry that their asylum officers are going to have to do more asylum claims, but they had an opportunity to fix this and they didn't. And I'm getting a little passionate here because I'm running on 5 days of very little sleep. But this is our responsibility and we need to fix it.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Susannah, please.
And I want to hit on two things. I also, Camille talked about that the immigration system is specifically built in order to catch people and snag them so they can't move forward in the process. Like it's prohibitive. It's intentionally so. And, this is often a thing we talk about, and Camille and I have spoken about this, is that you'll hear the line, the immigration system, we all know the US immigration system is broken. It's not broken, it's sabotaged. And we need to start calling it that. And then the second is, at this point, towards Chris's very, I think, deservedly passionate sort of statement that the US government had times to do this thoughtfully and to have the equivalent of processing and deciding which visa and how you're going to do this. Right now, it's an open, we're looking at an open combat theater on the ground. And that moment, calling for it seems tone deaf. For lack of a better word. And so when we talk about the idea that we've taken people previously from in Vietnam to Guam and that they were processed there, we did that through humanitarian parole, which I just want to quote because I know that you have so many lawyers in your audience, specifically the INA, the 212D5 that says that DOD, when approved by DOD and authorized by DHS, parole permits for aliens to enter the United States without a visa. That as a reference specifically to the idea that DOD can offer humanitarian parole to Afghans with DHS rubber stamping. So DOD has the power, according to the INA, to offer humanitarian parole to all these individuals with a rubber stamp from DHS. We could get them on planes, military planes, take them to a third country, take them to Fort Lee. DOD would have the power to do that right now with a rubber stamp from DHS. And that has so far not been, people didn't believe that was possible. I think we need to be very clear-eyed that State Department's processing skills right now are very limited in its impact to save lives, and that I think DOD needs to be treating this like a humanitarian disaster where it's bodies on planes, bodies to a safe place. And frankly, I think that this is important. The Pentagon sharing and backsliding and saying that first that they were going to take 30,000 Afghan parolees and now they're going, or evacuees, and then 22,000 were going to go to the US, come here to the US. And then since they've said, well, what we mean is that we have the capacity to take 22,000 to the US. And the next day they're saying, what we mean is we have the capacity to take up to. I want you to notice this very concerning backsliding on the amount of people we say that we're actually going to bring to safety, including wartime allies. I think it's deeply concerning.
Chris, let me come back to you to push on another part of this. Although again, I'd welcome Camille or Susannah to jump in as well, which is that there is a sphere that is under control of the United States, and that's the airport. But there is also a barrier that is being administered by the Taliban on the other side of the razor wire. The Biden administration appears to have had some luck engaging with the Taliban around certain aspects of evacuation around American citizens. At least the president certainly said in his remarks last night, look, the Taliban has said they're allowing Americans through, and that appears to be the case, not with uniform success, but at a more general matter. Certainly there are reports of American citizens being harassed, but not at the level of Afghan citizens. But what space is there for engagement with the Taliban to facilitate for these efforts? Are they likely to allow large-scale exits through their checkpoints on outside of the airport, which is in their control? And is there anything to be done about that diplomatically or otherwise? And then more importantly, I think that the bigger question here, and some of the harder question, is that we are on a limited time frame. It doesn't seem like it's a forever scenario. The president last night said we are willing to stay past August 31st if necessary to evacuate, I think, American citizens, what he said. That's past the original withdrawal deadline. But we don't know what the level of tolerance is for the Taliban, for our presence at the airport, nor what may require to expand that level of tolerance or push back. So how is that relationship playing into this, and what should we expect to it, or do we just not know? Is it all unknown at this point?
Well, I think that what I'll say on that is that the Taliban are an entity that up until a week and a half ago, maybe 2 weeks, had not governed a metropolitan area. Right. They did own some small towns and some provinces, but it wasn't until very recently, within the last 2 weeks, they started taking over major metropolitan areas in municipal and the municipal environment, and where they've had to start governing. And so we could tell the Taliban leadership everything we want, but the question remains is, do they have the capacity to have the command control from top to bottom to implement their promises? So if the Taliban says, oh yes, we're going to offer a humanitarian corridor down this area, and these are where people can go, we won't molest American citizens, visa holders, or fleeing Afghans, will the people on the ground respect that? And what we have seen so far is that they will not. They will respect it in a limited fashion, but there are lots of reports of Taliban checkpoints shaking down American citizens for money, requesting money be wired in order to pass through this checkpoint. And look, it's not in the Taliban's interest, the leadership anyways, to be seen in this light. And so if they can't even control their own troops on the ground in Kabul, when all the world is looking at this one city, I don't know how long they're going to be able to effectuate any type of real lasting cohesive peace treaty with us to get our people out. So I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
Anything on that front? Okay.
Scott, you asked like 3 questions in one. The last question I thought was interesting, but I can't remember it now.
I think my last question is, what's the time frame that we're operating on here? The president suggested we can go past August 31st, but we're talking at this point, that's 12 days away. Is it likely that are we seeing pushback by the Taliban? Have we gotten any reason to believe that we'll be able to go past that period, or are we actually operating on a narrower time frame?
Yeah, I think that's yes, that was certainly, that's what I was thinking about. And I think Chris really addressed the side of what we think we can expect based on the limited information we have now. Now that the Taliban is governing all of Afghanistan except for the Kabul airport. So I think I just want to add this. I think part of the calculation that we're seeing from Biden's ABC News interview yesterday was saying that, you mentioned that he committed to stay to get US citizens out. What about legal permanent residents? And for wartime allies, I just want to draw out what that means. Not just the idea of not saving refugees. There are American veterans who have been working with their interpreters and translators for years, in a program that was the SIV program that was always deeply troubled with inefficacies, illogical denials that were then overturned. 1 in 6 appeals were overturned. 1 in 6 after rejections, appeals were overturned. The appeals process was overturned the rejections in 1 out of 6 of the cases, right? So we had some deeply serious problems, and then significant delays, right? That it's over 3 years to go through the SIV program as an applicant on average, even though Congress mandated it be 9 months. That means that there are American veterans who have been working for 3 years, and in some case more, because that was the average, with their interpreters to try to get here. That's had terrible systematic problems. So if the Biden administration thinks that somehow the news cycle or the veteran groups are going to get over this once he's able to effectively withdraw U.S. forces, it's a bad read. And journalists who've been covering Afghanistan for years and have their own reporters and sources that they've been using for years are also well aware. So that's not going to disappear. I don't know who in the West Wing is reading them in on this, or at what secretary level they think that this is just going to go away. It's not.
Yeah, I think the point that Susannah is making is so critically important, especially the reaction in the military and veteran community. And Chris wrote a piece of I think a week ago that was so eloquent that sort of summed up, I think, some of those feelings. And I certainly don't want to put him on the spot on this, but also to go back to the August 31st deadline. It reminded me so much of the speech, or I'm sorry, the address that the president made. I can't remember the exact date, but in mid-July, the first time he addressed publicly, or maybe it was the second time he addressed publicly, the Afghan withdrawal. And one of the first questions he got from journalists that time, which notably he took none this past week, but one of the questions was, do you trust the Taliban as a partner in this? And he got really angry and sort of yelled back, no, of course I don't trust the Taliban. And it's a little astonishing to now see him almost speaking of the Taliban as a negotiating partner. And, they've given us this August 31st date, and, we're working within these parameters. And why do we think that they're going to honor? I mean, we already know they're not. We already know that they're in the crowds outside the airport, shooting guns, chain whipping, individuals who have connections to the US, looking for evidence, and in times going to the homes of individuals who are known to have worked with the US. And I think it's to sort of loop back to Susannah's point, the military community and the veteran community, which Chris can speak so much more on behalf of than myself, obviously, feels such a sense of betrayal. But it's not just them. Everyone who was sort of invested over the last 2 decades into helping rebuild Afghanistan. I mean, the women and the girls and everyone who supported them, to see what's happening there is dramatic. And this is a serious misread on the president's part if he thinks that he's just going to keep going and publicly stating this was the right decision and you have to believe me, and he's just going to sort of convince us all that was the case, because it's not. And I think he's seriously underestimating the deep sense of betrayal that many of us are feeling as a result of what we're seeing play out right now in Kabul and in Afghanistan.
Well, Chris, let me turn to you actually on that, if that's okay. Part of the thread that eventually connected us, I think it's fair to say, is that we're all members of Truman National Security Project, a group that whose members have been involved through various listservs and communications with a pretty incredible civil society effort to coordinate information sharing, specific cases, resources, towards moving towards moving towards doing what we can, what people can, and I won't claim any credits, I have not been particularly involved, to move things in the right direction at the airport and more broadly. Tell us a little bit about what Camille's talking about here. What is it, the reaction that the communities that you see in this listserv that have been most active on this, veterans communities, former humanitarian or humanitarian workers, former diplomats, lots of people, current humanitarian workers that have been involved in advocacy efforts around this for a long time are now on this effort. What have they been involved in? And what is the takeaway for a lot of those communities that Camille's getting at here? What is the experience that they're experiencing? And how does it compare to how a lot of other Americans may or may not be experiencing it?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I cannot say enough about how proud I am of the entire membership of the Truman National Security Project. It has been, my inbox is crashing, but it has been, I have never seen, never seen the Truman community rally around on this and take such efforts into their hands, from advocacy work to getting people out of harm's way on the front lines in Kabul, and from providing mutual aid efforts here in the United States. And so I just want to say, if there are any Trumanites out there, thank you for all that you're doing. But it's not just Truman, right? Truman is one part of his broader civil society that's mobilizing. I was on a Chamber of Commerce call yesterday morning, and they're eager to get engaged. And I was on, there are DoD contractors that are trying to figure out how to organize and to help as well. And this is, I can't remember who said it, if it was Camille or Susannah, but like, this is what I'm really trying to impress as the administration is, you have civil society ready to go. I mean, millions of dollars are being raised to help this. People are desperate to figure out where they plug in. And I think it is both everyone I think understands the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding, and they want to help. And Americans have always been very good at helping in humanitarian crisis, whether it's an earthquake or a hurricane or a refugee crisis. But it gets to something deeper. We have, for the past 20 years, been focused on the events of 9/11, and everything that has happened in my adult life is the result of that September day. And this, the collapse of Afghanistan is a direct through line from that Tuesday morning to today. And it was brought up the effect that this has on veterans. I will say, and I know there are veterans on this call right now. I'd have to ask yourself, veterans, how many times has someone said thank you for your service? And you get this kind of weird feeling inside of you, and you're like, well, I don't know, I just kind of did what I did. And I am grateful for my 10% off at Lowe's and my free dinner on November 11th at Applebee's. But at the end of the day, all we really wanted was to show that our sacrifice was worth it. That we signed up to do something. We thought we were doing something greater than ourselves. We signed up specifically to try to help people. And, we knew we weren't going to be in Afghanistan forever. And we knew we had to leave. And we knew all we wanted to do was when we left to make it a better place. And we knew that it was going to be tough when we left. Everyone was very clear about that. But what we didn't expect was the total collapse of this mission that we spent the last 20 years working towards. And we didn't expect, frankly, the callous indifference of the people in power to that. And that they, when people in power and when the President of the United States gets up on national television and essentially blames the people who are fleeing for their lives, people that I served alongside of, that people on this call served alongside of, that affects us really deeply. And it is why you're seeing so many people rallying right now and trying to solve this crisis.
I would also
Thank you.
love to speak.
Go ahead,
to that.
Susannah.
And Chris, thank you so much for articulating that. I can't say how much I appreciate that for so many different reasons. And so many of the problematic narratives that were delivered in Biden's speech, and including the idea that the Afghan military has to be willing to fight and stand up for the country they want. The Afghan military, which lost 66,000 forces, each year lost more forces than America did in all 20 years combined. 46,000 Afghan civilians died. It's callous to say that they need to have sacrificed, So I'll just say that first. And then second, those kind of narratives really hurt the idea of any future humanitarian support or women's education support from the State Department or the government or Congress approving funding for such an effort in the future, which means it feels like that Marshall moment where you just leave and you never look back. And you could have made a difference and you didn't. And then this issue that Chris brings out about veterans, I work for a resettlement agency. I worked on refugee related and conflict related advocacy for my entire career. And so 17 years ago began working on it. And I was working with veterans. I then in 2008 started working with a group of veterans that created something called the List, like Iraqi interpreters and translators that work with them. The reason I belong to the Truman National Security Project is because I stood up a legal organization that had me working directly with US veterans who were trying to get their interpreters and translators open. Through the course of the post 9/11 world and our wars, the immigration community and the veteran community have been integrated in helping in efforts with related to Iraqis and Afghans. That's not going to go away. So like refugee organizations and immigration organizations are looking at their veteran partners that they've worked with for 13 years and realizing the moral injury that this administration is saying that veterans can bear. We say we still want to do so much about the number of Vietnam vets who experience homelessness, drug addictions, untreated PTSD. One of the things that they carried was moral injury for not only what happened in Vietnam, but who they didn't save when we left. And I know this because my own neighbor was a Vietnam vet and a Vietnamese family who he helped save in Houston, Texas, that has a giant Vietnamese population, refugee population. There's no overstating the relationship that interpreters and translators have with their military service members that they work with, and then the over time integration with immigration officials who they were working with very closely on their translators' cases. It's devastating to see what's happening in Afghanistan, and to me, it's also heartbreaking to think about the impact that we'll have on the people that we've been working with for over a decade in the veteran community. And I just want to share, if anybody needs to talk who's a veteran, I just want to share the hotline of 1-800-273-8255, because you're hearing it from a lot of vets where they need someone to talk to. So I hope they reach out to each other.
Yeah, and to take it.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, not to take it into a different direction entirely, but Susannah and I are also immigration advocates, and I'm an immigration attorney. I've been representing asylum seekers and people seeking protection for a long time, and we both kind of went through some pretty terrible 4 years in the previous administration, and this president came into office saying he was bringing humanity and decency back. I mean, his words, right? Humanity and decency back to our immigration system, and I don't see the humanity or the decency in the decisions that he's making right now.
I want to bring the conversation. We only have a little bit of time left. Back to the experience in Afghanistan, what's happening there, because this, of course, while we're looking this incredibly urgent moment in the face, this is, even for the people who get through it, just the first step in what is a long process that hopefully ends in safety somewhere overseas, hopefully in the United States or somewhere else overseas. But there's a lot of steps that happen next, and I think it's important people know about those, and I want to talk to you all briefly about them. So for those people who get through, for the Afghans who get through, first I want to come to you, Camille. Talk to us a little bit about what the legal processes they are going to face. Let's say they make it to Uganda or Kuwait or one of these safe harbors, maybe eventually to Guam if that becomes an option. What is the sort of timeline and life going to be like for that interim period where they're working through these legal challenges, these legal processes, of which there are a number of possibilities depending on their background and what their experience has been with the United States. Tell us a little bit about that. What is going to come next when this immediate crisis passes in one direction or the other for the people who actually do make it through to the other side?
Yeah, I think that's going to be very fact dependent. The individuals who had SIV applications pending and who were fairly along in the process, at least had an interview or such, we saw them move pretty quickly through Fort Lee, really actually a matter of days. For those who are further along in the SIV process and qualify for an SIV, I mean, SIVs are actually very limited in scope to for individuals who worked as interpreters and who face harm as a result of that work and who can get letters and other supporting evidence from their military counterparts in the US military and such. There's a lot of requirements, but for those who do qualify for a special immigrant visa, an SIV visa, that could take, well, who knows? I mean, in the past, I think at previous administration, it was about 4 years. So they're saying that they're surging resources now to get through those petitions. They do seem to be accelerating from what the processing was over the last 4 years, but certainly not any necessarily faster than it was before that, under the Obama administrations, the Bush, the Clinton, but that's it. So hopefully that'll accelerate, and we're looking at, a few months. Immigration petitions take an enormous amount of time. There's a lot of background security checks that need to happen. There's interviews, there's a lot of processing that go through an agency that is incredibly backlogged as it is, both because of the lack of resources of the last few years, as well as the shutdowns due to the pandemic. But hopefully we're looking at, a matter of months, not years, for those individuals. There's also been a process established for those who don't qualify for an SIV visa, but do have a fear of harm in Afghanistan through the refugee resettlement process, which Susannah was addressing earlier with the P1, P2 categories. They've announced that they're going to open those up to Afghans who are facing harm, but they haven't really set up a process, and they're still ramping up refugee processing right now. So I think historically in the past, and Susannah can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think generally in the past that took at least 2 years once somebody had been confirmed for resettlement in the US.
Yeah.
So, and
that number is skewed because, that wasn't my experience. You couldn't move people that quickly. I believe that number is one that we use a lot within the immigration field, but it means that once it's gone, it's already been referred to the US. So getting through the pipeline to be referred, I mean, the average from my experience standing up a resettlement agency in the Middle East, it's a resettlement legal aid clinic. It was around 4 to 6 years in terms of our clients, because there's just so few would ever make it through.
Yeah, and then for the rest, those who won't qualify for an SIV and won't qualify for the refugee resettlement pipeline, that just kind of depends on a number of factors. If they're not in the US or in Guam, or anywhere like that, where they can avail themselves of US law, then it's going to depend on whether they have an ability to immigrate to the United States through regular channels, right? Family petitions, employment visas, work petitions, things like that. That process will take however long it takes. It's, like I said, it's incredibly backlogged right now. The backlogs are only growing as the pandemic continues to force the closures of both the border and the consulates abroad and such. And then for those who are in the US, they may have those options available to them. They may be able to apply for asylum. They may, it's possible the administration could make a decision to sort of fast track those asylum applications if they chose. But the asylum process right now is in a bit of a state of flux. But generally speaking, I'd say it takes about, from the time you file your petition to the time, or application, to interview and having a decision is usually, I'd say, within 6 months, or it was pre-pandemic. Now it's sort of all been blown apart. But then if you're not granted at the asylum office, then you go to have a hearing in front of an immigration judge and immigration court, and that process can take years. But that presupposes that you're already in the United States.
Well,
so it's a very complicated answer.
No, absolutely. But I think, the complication and the level of challenge that are yet to come are important for people to know about this process. Susannah, let me come to you for what is another important part of this process, and that is for those who do get to the point where they get to resettle the United States, what that looks like. I think those of us who grew up near refugee communities, I grew up in Northern Virginia, where there's a very large Vietnamese refugee community, among other refugee communities. And I had lots of classmates and friends whose family came from that experience. It's a really unique experience, and it's implemented by the federal government in coordination with a number of agencies, including your day job, as you described it, at Lutheran Immigration Refugee Resettlement Services. Excuse me. Tell us about that process, what it's going to look like, and what the resettlement end of this is going to look like for the Afghan population that is able to get that far.
Thanks for asking that, because I always love that story. And for what it's worth, it's Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. But no, I'm always like, you're in the vicinity. This is great. It's Lutherans, refugees, resettlement. I actually really love this part. And it actually, of course, makes this all the more devastating because the part where they come to the US, it's just the most satisfying work. And maybe it's because I grew up in Houston, a city that had just massive, like holing out of the center during the oil crisis. Like downtown was abandoned, and we lived downtown, and immigrants moved into our neighborhood, including Vietnamese immigrants with their American veteran family member. That's what they called them. And then just immigrants all over the community that actually brought it back to life. There were restaurants, there were all of these, like, it literally did feel like it was resurrected. And now it's, my parents' neighborhood is, there's a lot of young kids who want to move there because it's got so many great restaurants and all of these things. The story of refugees coming on this side is, here's the system. The US decides that they're going to resettle someone. 9 agencies get together and say, we have these linguistic or housing sort of capacities for this population of refugees we can accept. And literally every 2 weeks they get together, and resettlement agencies are like, yeah, we have the capacity to take this, like this family or that family. And then they show up in cities, and there is a robust network of faith-based organizations, of civil society, of community sponsors. When you think about the best of America, it literally is, if you are struggling for meaning in where America is morally, like being a part of resettlement is just some of the most satisfying part of it, because the earnest and joyous welcome exists. And every once in a while I would step into that world to try to remind myself, like, oh, we're going to be okay. And that's one of the reasons that Camille highlighted that the last administration was so difficult. And this administration has only accepted 6,000 refugees in this fiscal year, and the fiscal year is ending in September, right? So we don't have many refugees. We are not sure if we're going to have many Afghan SIVs, P2s, whatever. We're not sure if we're going to have vulnerable populations from Afghans showing up on US soil, period. So that's the inverse, which is, how beautiful the story can be. And yet we're not making it happen. And that's just a double tragedy.
So we're almost out of time, but I want to come to each of you with one last kind of two questions, I suppose, but interlocked. And that is, where do we have to go from here? Where do we have to go from our current state to get to the happy story that Susannah is describing? If that is the goal, as I think the Biden administration has said it is to get as many people as we can to safety. And I think as many Americans hope is the case. And I want to ask you first, what are the policy things that have to happen? I think a number of you already talked about the need to just start moving people out. But is there more, is that the primary focus that needs to be objective number one, or are there other changes that need to come? And then for those of us who are outside of government, who are private citizens, but who care deeply about this, who feel affected by this, what is it private citizens can do right now to help contribute to this cause and these sorts of efforts being pursued by whether civil society organizations or local organizations, any other channel to provide assistance? Why don't we start with you, Chris?
Yeah, I could probably talk with that. So as far as the policy implications, it actually goes hand in hand with the second thing you said there. There needs to be a through line between civil society and the U.S. government so that we can help the administration with what's going on right now, and we can tell them what's going on in the United States and in Afghanistan, and how we can resolve issues that are happening. That's also going to be really important for on the back end. This is going to flip, as Susannah and Camille mentioned. There's going to be a massive refugee outflow that the administration is going to need to lean heavily on civil society. So from a policy aspect, open flow of communication, a through line of communication between civil society and military. It needs to be a mass evacuation, regardless of status, regardless of triage, or regardless of paperwork, and that they need to keep that airport open or some sort of exfil operation open in Kabul as long as possible. So those are the three things. And then I don't want to step on anyone's toes, but as far as what a private citizen can do, it feels helpless right now to not have anything you can do. And I know Americans are guilty, and we're guilty spenders. And so if you want to donate, I would encourage you to donate to groups like LIRS. and other refugee resettlement agencies, because man, are they going to need it in a couple weeks.
I can go next because I was actually going to say also what Chris just ended on, which is refugee resettlement agencies have been completely depleted over the last few years. You know, they lost their funding as the numbers of refugees the US was prepared to accept went down, and they're going to need so many resources. So donate, contact your local refugee resettlement agency and see what they might need. I mean, a lot of times they need very specific items. I wouldn't organize a donation drive without talking to them first, you know, because they know the families that they're expecting to arrive and they know what the needs are going to be. Sometimes it's a crib, sometimes it's winter clothing for children age 8 through 15. You never know. But I think in terms of what you can do, be ready to welcome them, be ready to show them what the best of America is, you know, be ready to show them that once they're here, they're in their new home. It's incredibly traumatic. Many of them, you know, didn't plan on leaving their home, right? They didn't plan on making their life in a new country half a world away. And I think anything that we can do to bolster that spirit of welcome is probably the best that individual citizens can do right now. And in terms of policy, look, I mean, we can talk about, you know, Chris said we don't want to say I told you so, but I told you so, or we told you so. But we are where we are, and we have to make a decision now how we move forward, and our policymakers and our elected leaders have to make a decision of how we move forward from this. And I think it's all up to all of us to make sure they understand what decisions we expect from them. This is not a divisive or divided issue. There's been bipartisan support the whole way through this. You know, Congress showed its intent to help allies when they passed the legislation that created the SIV visas in the first place. You know, so go to the protests, call your local elected officials or your representatives of Congress, write letters to the president, to the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, whomever, whatever way you have of participating in civic life, do that to make sure that they understand that we are not okay with the policy decisions that have been made and that led us to this point, and that we expect better from today moving forward.
Thanks, y'all. And I put LRS's website up there for this. I want to say that we work very closely with all resettlement agencies, and we're very grateful for our partnerships. So please consider any resettlement agency that's out there in the US, not just LIRS, but here's that one. And then also, if you would like to sponsor a family, this is a form you can fill out, and they'll figure out how to connect you with family sponsorship. But I want to say something. You know, those are the kind of things you might normally hear in a crisis that feels impossible. And it's such a wonderful, productive way to take pain and loss and put it someplace where there might be a seed of hope. I do want to say Lawfare's community is a little different than most. So I want to say something to your audience, which is in Vietnam, the people that were saved, they were often saved by extraordinary acts of individuals who used their boat, or military officials who decided to put, not without, they didn't vet folks, they just put folks on boats. There were also individuals of State Department officials who actually got folks on planes. There's an amazing Atlantic article that describes two gentlemen's efforts just to get private planes and into Saigon and get them out as fast as possible. So I want to say that this is the moment where the incredibly well-accessed community and readers of Lawfare can play a role. I know that it's unclear whether or not more planes can get into the commercial side. We know two major aerospace companies who would love to provide planes. We have high-level DoD contacts, but we don't have clarity that those planes can get into the commercial side. It's literally a coordination issue. So if you have people in Lawfare who know a way to get those commercial flights that are being offered by aerospace companies into the commercial side, please reach out. List at evacuateourallies.org is receiving individual Afghan case information, but you can also use that to say, hey, I have a contact. And I know that I was contacted by someone I haven't spoken, someone just texted me and it showed up on my screen who I haven't talked to in 10 years, who's worked at the State Department. So for the unique audience at Lawfare, please remember that individual acts of assistance and heroism saved lives in Vietnam and can here. And then the final is two pieces of legislation, because I work on congressional affairs, so I can't not do this. The first is all of these people will be coming, whoever comes, they will be coming through humanitarian parole because we didn't process them. We didn't anticipate this. And by we, I mean the administration didn't process them quickly enough to get them the benefits they deserve. Meaning like when you arrive, you get placement benefits and assistance, introductions to jobs and employers, et cetera, et cetera. They're not getting that because we didn't do this right. We didn't botch this. So Congress needs to move to ensure that they provide resettlement and placement services, resettlement services to the Afghans who are arriving under humanitarian parole right now. And then the second, and this is important, which is we had friends in the administration. This is supposed to be a place where we should have been able to access and really make the case to the administration to get Afghan allies out as soon as they, confirmed our withdrawal in April. And we weren't able to effectively make the case or get response from the administration. So we said at the time, we didn't want another Saigon. Now we have something that is something else. Kabul might be something else entirely. And that might be the next thing we name as a botched evacuation of wartime allies. There needs to be a high-ranking official in the US government who it is their duty to answer the call to protect wartime allies. We're proposing an ombudsman for allies, in which there will be a high-ranking official in the US government whose job it will be to look out for the interests of and towards the protection of wartime allies. And I know that there are a number of Congress members who are interested in this, and I think we need it because even if you have friends in the administration, if you couldn't make the case now, then no generation should ever have to go through this again. No generation of veterans and no generation of Afghan allies should ever feel like there's nobody looking out for them.
Well, we unfortunately are out of time and we'll have to leave the conversation there. But I know all three of you have been working incredibly hard for the last 5 days, on very little sleep, and probably will be doing the same for the next several days. So thank you so much for finding the time to join us here today on the Lawfare Podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Scott. Bye.
And thank you for everybody watching in the audience. That is the conclusion of our chat today. We're going to put a video up on this on the website, same website where we advertise the event on lawfareblog.com. So keep an eye out there. It'll be up as soon as it's done processing. Usually it should take an hour or two at the most. And then a slightly edited version of this will be released as a podcast tomorrow on the Lawfare Podcast feed. So you can find it there. We'll also make an effort to share some of the links that were in the chat and make them available to folks. So keep an eye out for that as well. Thank you for making the time today. Talk about this important issue. Have a good weekend and best of luck to everyone in the days to come.
Thank you, Scott.
Bye.